The university is no longer just in crisis, it's actively collapsing. Scholē IRL is a podcast dedicated to understanding the worlds people are building in its ruins already today. Each week, we explore the emerging experimental sphere of para-academia, with thinkers and builders doing the work to create spaces for communal study and knowledge-making alongside and outside the conventional university ecosystem. I'm your host, Sarah Begovac.
And I'm your co-host, Ira Allen. Together, we're learning each week how to salvage Scholē from institutional hoarding and collapse alike.
Join us in reclaiming time and space for something like leisurely thinking outside instrumental ends. Scholē in real life.
Hi there, everyone. I am Ira Allen. I'm one of your co-hosts for the podcast Scholē IRL, Scholē in real life. And for this inaugural, or I guess more accurately, pre-inaugural episode of the podcast, I'm interviewing my co-host, Sarah Begovac. Sarah is really the driver of our work together on this pod. And as you'll hear in my interview with her, she's an exciting, deeply relatable, ordinary human being who is also a capital T thinker. And I think in a lot of ways, who and how Sarah is, I don't know, exemplifies some of what I would hope our podcast makes feel more available to more people. Sarah's highly atypical in a lot of ways, but she's also somebody who's making a space for herself as a thinker, not in a PhD program, not in a traditional academic job, not in a think tank track in this sort of, highly circumscribed other version of capital T thinking in and around academies, but rather as a person in the world who has deliberately carved out time to commit to who she is as a person whose sense of being is harmed when she doesn't make space for thinking, doesn't make space for study. And so, in a lot of ways, our podcast together, like I said, it's a project we've both worked on quite a bit, but it's a project that's driven by Sarah's effort to think through how to make a space for herself as somebody who thinks in the world. And like any serious person who wants to make something cool, she arrived at the idea that what we should probably be doing is talking to other people who have made something cool. So that's what the podcast is about. The podcast is us interviewing people every single week about the work that they've done to build a space for Scholē, for something like the leisured study of worlds that have been passed on to us in symbols on behalf of something like the common good. So we do these interviews every week. And to kick that all off, I thought it would be cool for me to interview Sarah, who is, again, the sort of brains behind this operation, if you will. So without any further ado, I'm going to jump right into the interview with Sarah today. Hi, Sarah. Welcome to Scholē IRL, your podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing good. Happy to be here. and this thing that we created together, it's nice.
Thanks for joining me on your podcast. I'm delighted to be interviewing you today for our inaugural episode. And let me just start with a question, and just so our listeners know, we haven't actually talked about any of our questions in advance. So I'm going to just ask you things that come to my mind based on knowing a little bit about where you're coming from and where I think we're coming from. So my first question is, why am I calling it your podcast?
That's a good question. I think a lot of this has been a discovery of what it means to be a thinker. And for me, what that means to be a thinker,
Mm.
both within the institutions and outside of the institutions, I found myself in both spaces. And I have questions around what that entails now and a space of what a space around that looks like. And I think that's what started me on the journey of creating this podcast, is that I wanted to connect and find people who are also thinking in this way.
Mm.
and who had questions or who had challenges in either accessing the university or being within it and then finding themselves outside of it, and how they made sense of that. Because I was trying to make sense of that. I didn't know what it meant to think alongside of it in my experiences. So I wanted to reach out and see who was out there and who thought along
Mm,
those lines.
mm.
Um, yeah, I think that's where I calling it, why we're calling it my podcast, and what started me on this. It was just kind of a journey of fellow thinkers who don't find themselves in an institutional home right now, and what it means to create a sense of home, or what it means to move from a home that used to be a home but doesn't feel like that anymore.
Yeah. I mean, I've mentioned to some of our guests when we've done interviews that in some ways this is the "What Should Sarah Begovac Do with Her Life" podcast, and I'm joking, but I'm also not joking, right? Like, one of the things that's always really struck me about you, since you were my grad student here at NAU, is you are somebody who thinks. Like, you
Mhm.
really, you care about the thinking. You care about the thing because it intrinsically matters to you to try to understand shit, um, as best as you can, and in some ways that's theoretically what our entire endeavor at the university is about. But as everybody who teaches in university knows, that's not as widely distributed a focus as could be desired. And so I
Mhm.
think for me, like, one of the things that's really striking about the difference in our positionalities is, like, I have a place. I mean, it's
Mhm.
going away. The university is circling the drain. Things are not going well. But for now, I'm located. And I'm located in a way that basically says, yes, Ira, you are allowed to be a thinker. We have some resources, not a lot of resources, and they're always being threatened, and they really are going away. But at least for now, we have some resources. And I think you, by contrast, are somebody who, like, we're really on a wavelength a lot of times. Like, we started the idea of the podcast, you pitched coming out of our collaboration on this article for Philosophy and Rhetoric on thinking and transition. But the you don't have a place that says, you, Sarah Begovac, this is your identity, this is what you're supposed to be doing. And I don't want to idealize the position of, like, being a professor in a university, because an awful lot of it is not thinking. And it's certainly not the case that my administrators care all that much whether I'm thinking.
Mhm.
But I can steal space for thought, and it's not only permitted but sort of modestly encouraged. And I think, like, and that's just not true for most people in the world. And so I wonder if you'd share maybe a little bit about what it's looked like for you concretely so far. Like, obviously, we're kind of mapping some of this in this podcast itself, but what does it look like? What has it meant for you to try to make space for yourself as a person who thinks, as a person who studies, as a person who wants to understand the world, in the time maybe between, being an undergraduate, master's student here at NAU, and now, and this podcast? What has that been for you concretely? What have you been
Mm.
up to, and why did you think it might work?
That's a good question. I think to trace that is to trace sort of the beginning of how I saw myself as a thinker, or the first time I saw myself as a thinker, which was within a university space. So that was my first home for thinking. Um, I just found myself wanting to test the limits of that and wanting to go beyond that. And not only within the walls that created such thinking spaces, because, like, that's easy to create something that is designed to create spaces for thought. But what does it mean to take that outside of that into a different domain? And how, what are the conditions that make that possible? So I found myself still studying, which I didn't really see it as studying at the time, but still studying how to make that possible outside of the university spaces and all the challenges that can come with that in different domains. I was in a nonprofit world, and then I found myself moving out to Boston because I'm like, I found myself wanting to return back to the university space. I felt like Boston to me represented the symbol for an educational paradigm, or how to make an educational paradigm. And I found myself moving out here to take a risk on discovering what that means. And I found resoundingly that it wasn't as easy as I thought, which I should have thought moving out there. You know, you can't just move to a new place and be like, I'm a thinker, hear me think. You know, it's not like that's not how it works. But I wanted to test that symbol of what it means to be that in a sphere that was honestly so unfamiliar to me and took me a while to adjust to. And I found that I was falling. It was hard for me to make a space for that, at least initially. But I never stopped thinking about what that could be. I found myself just like self teaching myself philosophy, self teaching myself rhetoric, still thinking in these ways of how we construct our lenses for learning and what makes that accessible or not accessible to people, what makes people construct their belief systems around learning, or what makes them see themselves as a thinker from thinkers who are known for doing that. And so I found myself still doing that. And then you reached out and you're like, hey, I had this idea of like Scholē, and I'm like, hey, I think I'm doing that, but I don't have the language of what that
Mm,
was at the time.
mm,
I was just self teaching myself, and it was a pretty. At the time, I felt like I needed to do this on my own and develop my own thought process outside of institutional thinking because I felt limited within that space. And I realized that this is something that is being shared on a larger understanding of people who still want to think, still have curiosity, still have, I don't know, ways they want to relate or understand the world, but that isn't being fostered in their day to day work environments.
mm. Yeah, can I actually jump in there for a sec? Because to me, that's one of the things that like came out of a lot of our interviews so strongly, and it really resonates with this. The few times that I've taught courses at the university that are, I don't know, there's people in the courses who are not enrolled students; they're just there because they want to be there. It really highlights how there's this sort of desire to think in community, to think with others, to study, and it's something you've reflected on to me in the past, is like this way in which study, you can do lots of reading and thinking on your own. There's nothing preventing a person from doing that, but there's something about study, or about what we're thinking about as Scholē in the pod, like that's more about how we relate with one another in trying to understand complex ideas, complex texts, the conditions of our shared existence, all of it, right? And it's really striking that the university as a system, as like an economic engine, totally recognizes that this desire exists and is always trying to come up with one or another version of continuing ed that will be profitable,
Mm.
right? That like there's and it's really bad at it. Most universities are super bad at like really attracting people to just come and think, because they're always hoping that somehow there'll be a little bit of like a cash cow kind of element to this. And it seems like there's almost something like, when you try to make it be a cash cow, you just ruin it, you fuck it up, you break it. And so yeah, one of the things that for me has been really cool working with you, first on our like collaborative scholarship, but then in developing the podcast and interviewing people, all the rest of the stuff, has been the way we'll talk about some stuff and then you'll go away and just do a bunch of reading and think about a bunch of stuff, and we come back and talk. And to me, like this is the essence of what we hope for in universities, and that it sometimes happens and it often it's hard to get it to happen in a lot of ways, and people have a lot of material demands on them. Um, and so I don't want to ask you any questions that are going to get you in trouble at your job. But like, how do you navigate creating space for yourself as somebody who is like, no, I'm gonna commit to this as part of who I am. Yeah, fine. There's not a place in the world prepared for me to do or be that, but I'm gonna do it anyways. And that takes material resources. That's not magic, right? It's metabolic. It literally, your body in space and time, um, doing shit as a thinker. How do you make space for that? What does that look like for you?
Mm. I always say like commit yourself to this is who I am. I think that in itself was a process because I didn't
Mm,
really see that as who I was. I just saw myself as someone who I don't know. It's hard to see myself as a scholar because I didn't have the symbol of being a scholar or being like making scholarship or like producing knowledge or like making this space for like, I don't know, ongoing conversations around what scholarship is. I didn't see myself as that. I just found myself just, I don't know, I feeling like I needed to like protect or have like, I don't know, there was a sense of like being that I couldn't ignore. And I tried to ignore that sense of being through just doing a traditional like job, just doing the day-to-day like activities, and then accepting that as like what is normative of an experience of being a young professional and not having just resources otherwise to think otherwise. So it's just kind of like accepting that sort of producer labor paradigm that I felt
Mm,
like was partially. I tried to accept that and not engage in those activities, but then I found
mm,
myself, it hurt my sense of being, and I found I
mm,
wasn't able to compartmentalize those two. So I found myself needing to still come up with like, still engage in reading, still come up with like alternative ways of thinking about knowledge spaces because it mattered to me. Because I felt like I can't accept that paradigm, and I feel like a lot of people were in a position where we either have to accept it because we don't know other paradigms exist, or we have to like just, I don't know, not imagine futures of education because we're in the day-to-day laboring of making ends meet and of paying for cost of living and paying for you know just to
yeah,
survive. We're in survival mode. um,
yeah,
and I wanted to counter that, but also being in survival, it was this weird tension that like I felt like this is the only way out for me. I can't just be in survival mode. It's hurting my sense of being, and I find myself shrinking. And I don't want to
mm,
feel myself shrinking. I want to find myself making
mm.
space. But if I can make space for myself, then maybe I can make space for others to know that it's a possibility. Um,
Fuck yeah.
that's
Yeah, yeah, that's really cool. That so there's it's and the phrase I keep hearing you say there is hurting my sense of being, and I think that's a really important phrase. Like that's a really important way of registering this insight that motivates one of the episodes of the season that people think that's part of our sense of being. It's part of what we do, and some people have that like much closer to the surface in a sense. Like you're somebody who has that so close to the surface that trying to repress it was not good, like capital
yeah.
N capital G, not good. And I think like not everybody has that as close to the surface, but everybody has that. That's part of what it's like to be somebody is we think. And there's something about the kind of survival based, I don't know, the grind, the organization of the world in ways that are like you should either just be surviving or you should be blowing off your like excess energy in leisure. Like, it ain't that deep, bro. Don't think
Mm,
about it. Don't overthink it. Don't do any of those things. Like that's if you're not working, what you should be doing is somehow like immersing yourself in a space of total relaxation where there's no mental activity or something, um,
hmm.
or where it's like totally captured for like the small details of a hobby, which is, I mean, I've gotten super into mountain biking. I'm pretty into guns, so I'm like, I have to admit, over the years, I've become a hobbyist. I resonate with those small details, and I want to acknowledge that there's ways in which those can lead to thinking, but there's also ways in which they can kind of like be what happens outside of people's working hours that captures their capacity for thinking or their need to think and like trains it into something maybe more imminent, less transcendent, less going beyond. And so more shrinking. So it's really cool for me to hear that part of what's been at stake for you has been committing to somebody being one who thinks and one who thinks in community even as an identity peg, as this is just once you say this is who I am, then it actually changes what you need to do to organize your life. You're like, oh well, if this is who I am, then I need to do things that make space for that because otherwise I'm just kind of fucking myself. If I'm
Mm,
hearing you right, is that
hmm.
yeah. I want to ask about how that sense of self relates to this thing that we've been trying to get at under the heading of Scholē. And I know that's a little bit of an unfair question since that was like my preoccupation when we started working together. But you know what? You sat down and reread a shitload of Aristotle to start thinking through that particular terminology, and we've talked a lot about that. I think on the pod, but certainly in our conversations in terms of what it means to think in relation or think in ways that are not just the individual identity peg. Um, would you say more about maybe the struggles to produce space for that? Like what that, again, like really concretely, what that's looked like? And now you know how our guests feel when we're asking them to be really concrete about shit. Or like more abstractly kind of reflecting on it, what it means. But what you see is that maybe the tensions between yourself as a thinker, this is an identity you've committed to, and yourself as needing to be in community with other people to be a thinker in the ways that makes sense to you and that you want to do that.
Mm. Yeah, it's hard to articulate the struggles sometimes. So I feel like I've like just like internalized them as like that is just like what it takes to do a project like this or to make something like this is that is just by nature is going to entail like working late night hours after work and having like like lesser capacities to like do other activities to like make me yeah it's a lot of late night hours. It's a lot of how do I want to say this? I guess it's a lot of like just coming to terms with and negotiating different symbols for what constitutes I don't know, like a good life or meanings. I feel like
Mm,
when I go into my day-to-day work environments, I'm constantly it's reinforcing a type of narrative of how you should move through life, that you
mm,
should absorb these skills, you should be a good worker, you should like climb up an already pre-established ladder, a
mm,
hierarchy in order to obtain a goal, and then you'll meet that metric of success, and then that will be what determines a good life, or that's be what determines your sense of fulfillment or your sense of flourishing is following this pre-established track. And every day that's reinforced when I go into a working environment that this is like what the path is for you. And I think a lot of people, there's these inherited tracks of what a good life is or what a good way of spend your time is. And it's these already worn out. Honestly, I feel like there's a lot of discourse emerging around people don't want to accept that as the
mm,
normative way of progressing through life. There's a challenge of that, but there's not a or there's a growing space for negotiating alternatives. And I feel like I found myself having to divide my time and having to divide like my own way of like knowing and developing my own way of knowing from like prescribed ways of what is being told to me through my environment, and being aware that that is just a symbol but still being affected by that symbol and feeling bad for not progressing in a linear way, but still
mm,
knowing that this is what is true to me and knowing those two things can exist at the same time, and feeling more so my own being okay with not having a map drawn out for me, because
mm,
there are maps I feel like that are drawn out from academic life, from professional life, that are collapsing, that aren't
yeah,
holding their weight in a lot of ways. I don't think we have the means to think otherwise because those means are kind of determined for us. And that hurts. That really hurts. I feel like there are alternative means. There's this overcoming that for the daily like need to like survive and to like work in order to make this like minimum output of survival to like afford rent, to afford all these things that are increasing in cost but not increasing in other aspects of life. Yeah, it's a struggle to find those means and to know that those means are available, even if in different cultural contexts it seems like it's not. And at the end of the day, all you do have time is for like doom scrolling or like passively absorbing narratives of what constitutes a good life, even though it's not in those words, but it's in those words of how you should
mm,
organize meaning in your life. The meaning making is done for you, I feel like, in these different
mm,
avenues. So it's kind of taking that meaning making and understanding you are that meaning maker, or you can be a meaning maker, and that your experiences are meaningful no matter if they don't follow a traditional line.
Mm,
I think that's the transition I found myself going into. But it's hard because it doesn't. I feel like I'm out of line sometimes, and that's
mm,
hard.
it doesn't like track neatly. I love their description of this. And I have to say, as you're talking, like I'm imagining that resonating so much for a lot of people. Like what you're describing is this experience of how do I make a meaningful life in a collapsing world that still wants me to go to work and climb some stupid fucking ladder.
Hmm.
Like, but it's a ladder to nowhere. We all know it's a ladder to nowhere. It's not a mystery. Like any reasonable person can look at the world and be like, wow, you got a lot of ladders to nowhere around here. Um, and yet, and I think this is a really important point, and this is something you said that I think a lot of people will really resonate with, and yet it still makes a kind of emotional demand. It's still, there's a sense of like the force of normativity, the general sense of sociality, as like this. I don't want to be this. I'm actually actively choosing to be something else because I think it's correct. But, and also, oh, that's super uncomfortable. It feels actually really weird because I can't be like, I'm an X. There's
Hmm.
not like, you show up in a space, and we've talked about this sometimes. You're like, so what do you do? Oh, I'm a thinker.
No, yeah, no, literally, or like I'm in like yeah.
Now, and we do, in fairness, we have a phrase, right? We have the phrase, and it's one of these phrases that's like really fraught relative to the university system and its distribution of cookies, right? Which is the phrase independent scholar. I'm an independent scholar. And the fact of the matter is, you are, in fact, an independent scholar. But independent here is one of these, like, it's one of these, like, pharmacon words, right? It's like both the medicine, the cure, and the poison. You're like,
Hmm.
the independent scholar is the one who participates in Scholē, who participates in the community of knowledge making and sort of a leisured approach to thinking, even if it's scrabbled out somewhat difficultly. And at the same time, doesn't have a place that authorizes them that they can go into a new social setting and say, I am an X. And I feel like a lot of like we interviewed people for this first season who are doing all kinds of different stuff. Some are professors like I am. Some are not in the academy at all. Some are in these sort of interstitial spaces like you are. But there, I feel like to some extent everybody that we interviewed is, at least this is something I took out of the interviews that I found like really inspiring. They're all making spaces, they're
Mm.
all doing a thing. Um, and it seems like there's this way in which if you're not making a space, if you're not, or joining somebody who's making a space, like if you're not doing a thing that is maybe at odds with or orthogonal at least to the quote unquote traditional pathways, whether those are academic or professional or just working a job and taking vacations at the appointed hour, so on and so forth. But like if you're not part of making something different, I think, and nobody, I don't know if anybody we interviewed really said this, but it's just, I guess, kind of my reflection listening to you and then thinking back over the interviews. If you're not making something different, you're not participating in making something different, that weight of normativity is so crushing, it's almost impossible to escape, I think. It's
Yeah.
like, yeah, and it's like if you're doing something else, you're like making a thing. It's like, all right, I can live with that, right? I think
Hmm.
Joan Baez, the folk singer, at some point said, action is the antidote to despair." And I think there's an element of that that's like, if you're making something, you still feel the weight of normativity, still
Mm.
feels difficult in some ways, but it's not as crushing. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, that does. And I remember in one of our interviews, they talked about I forgot who it was, but someone talked about like the sacrifices that are being made, and like, it's not an easy path to do this. And I thought
Mm.
that was really resonant because it's not. It's not. It's really there's a lot of challenges overcoming with that, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's another thing you touched on just a second ago that we didn't really talk with much about with our interviewees, but obviously you and I have talked about a bunch, which is staggered collapse. The whole fucking thing's falling apart,
Mm.
right? And I think, to me, like, one of the things I think we're trying to do, like, on the one hand, this is what should Sarah Begovic do with her life, but it's also like, what should Sarah Begovic do with her life as the world falls apart?
Mm.
Not just like in general. Like, there's a world and it's a good, stable world, and we don't know where Sarah Begovic fits into it, but gosh, we'll find her a good spot. Like, in the if the world were thus and such, you'd have my 100% wholehearted, committed support. But there's also this way in which we that's not the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's what should Sarah Begovic do with her life as the world is sort of going through this staggered collapse process? What does it
Mm-hmm.
look like to? And I think this is where one of my kind of big interests in the pod has been. What does it look like to salvage space for thinking, for study? What does it look like to carve out when there isn't space? When you're living a materially reproductive existence, maybe, what does it look like to say, well, part of material reproduction of existence, just bare survival, actually is space for thinking. Because that space for thinking is what you do to prevent harm to your sense of being. Right? That we
Mm.
aren't just being, that we are always also a sense of being. That we're that sense of being which is distinct from being.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
um, is something that is unavoidable to some extent. It gets captured in all kinds of shitty ways, and then maybe, to me, was really inspiring with a lot of the people we talked with. You can also maybe make space that aren't just like not shitty in the existing world, but are like salvaging this, I don't know, precious moral intuition. It is good to devote metabolic resources to the sense of being, to thinking about the sense of being, trying to make sense, to trying to make meaning of a life. So I guess, for me, like, I think a lot about this in I don't want to say elegiac mode, because that's a little freighted. It makes me think of like J.D. Vance hillbilly elegy. And though I am a hillbilly, I'm not that kind of hillbilly. Um, uh, but like, I do like I often think of my own professional life, my experience, as having slipped through, and I'm like one of the last generation that slipped through.
Mm.
Right. Despite being, I think, a moderately independent, in the positive sense, scholar, I have a place in the world, for now. And I got a sabbatical before sabbaticals started being canceled all over the place as a quote unquote cost saving measure. Um, I got a job as a fairly committed leftist, and got tenure and made full professor, as a entirely overtly who I am person. Um, Before the full force of a set of cultural attacks on universities came to bear on the next sort of big red scare or whatever. Anyways, I'm not bragging. I'm trying to describe like why I feel really fortunate, but also like I'm losing something I have, in a sense. Like, as
Mm.
all of this disappears and goes away, and it will, and not in the extreme distant future, like, it's already going away. I see it slipping away, but I see something slipping away that I've been really fortunate, through no special merit of my own. Like, I work hard like anybody else, but ultimately there's an enormous amount of luck. Um, I've been really fortunate to be, I think, maybe one of the last generational beneficiaries of what we sometimes call like the modern university system in the United States. And you're, in a sense, you're like part of the first generation who's structurally excluded from that. And so for me, I know a lot like what collapse feels like. It feels like losing something you have, and I wonder like
Mm.
what it looks like from where you're sitting. What does it mean to talk about the university's ecosystem as something that's falling apart, that we're trying to salvage things from? What does that look like from where you're sitting? What does that feel like?
Yeah, I like that question because that's also like the sense I get too is that something within me, something internal can be lost from these external institutional collapses that we see on a variety of different levels. And so it's kind of like combating that and recognizing that this, even though there might not be a place in the world externally, which
Mm.
is hard to come to terms with, because I actually, like, I've thought about going back into like a traditional academic space and pursuing a PhD, but then I think about that world in 4 to 6 years from now and what type of thinking would be useful for that. And certainly a PhD could be, but also
Don't rule it all the way out.
I know I'm not ruling it.
You might be able to steal a few resources still from the dying university ecosystem.
Dr. Begovac could still be a possibility. But I think for my making sense of the world right now, it's been, I don't know, like just part of my journey to be both inside and outside of
Mm.
it, to be in this gap that is generative. I feel like, 'cause I feel like I'm not, I have like the language of institutional, I don't know, institutional learning. Then I also have this language outside of institutional learning. So I feel like I can like almost bridge between the two. And I feel like that is the sort of space that's going to, spaces that are going to merge as these institutional spaces become harder to get access to, whether for like financial reasons or the funding cuts or any number of reasons. I feel like more bridges are going to need to be built between the two
Mm.
worlds, one that's emerging from not having access to that or not having a space from that, and also one that's from a space of that or how it was, to create something new. And I think
Mm.
that's how I make meaning out of uh, not being a school, but how I make meaning of making this space, is that I feel like that's the direction it's going toward. I don't see the university as is existing eternally for pathways for people, or traditional pathways for people. I think that's becoming more and more exclusionary, and I think it's more and more under threat. But I don't want people to feel like their sense of being's under threat if the university is under threat. They can still think. They
Mm.
don't have to have that attached
Mm.
to something external outside of them as a symbol outside of them. They're the ones that can, we can make the symbols. The university responds to us as symbol makers too. It's not just the symbol maker. We're
Mm.
also capable of making symbols in response to um, these spaces that are traditionally constituted as spaces for thinking. I think it's one and the same, or it can be one and the same. They're kind of like mutually reinforcing one another in this kind of like ongoing dialogue um, of what it means to make meaning, and also what these institutions determine what meaning is. I don't know if that makes sense. I feel like that's abstract, but
I feel like it's very abstract, but I think I'm tracking you. Um,
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I lost you a little bit on the very last piece, though. What it makes, so say more about what you mean by this kind of dialectic between the institution as a space for making meaning and
Mm.
individuals as meaning makers whose meaning making capacities you want to not be lost as this kind of institutional space maybe get becomes even less accessible or gets lost entirely.
Yeah, I like thinking this through because I feel like it gets kind of tangled in my mind too. Because I feel like they both create each other. I feel like the university is the traditional space for thinking, but it's also informed by people who are making sense of the world outside of it, and they're kind of
Mm.
one and the same. And I think people think that that individualization, or that kind of like just making sense of the world, if it's not through the language prescribed by institutional thoughts, that it's not as valuable or it's not as meaningful to constitute a body of knowledge or a field of knowledge, because it doesn't match that language game of the university. But it's not. They kind of one and the same inform each other. Um,
Mm.
and so I forgot where I was going with that, but I think with the world under collapse, I think, and the struggles that are coming from that as we know it, I think it's important to be attuned to that collapse and to know, to have time to know how you process that collapse,
Mm.
and to know that how you process it is a legitimate way of knowing in itself. It doesn't have to be confirmed by, or I don't know, validated by something external outside of you. I think even though there's signs of it, sometimes university spaces don't acknowledge the collapse, or they want you to kind of go
Yeah.
per the status quo and still get the degree and get the job and do the thing to make good life. Um, and almost by doing that, it bypasses a lot of that kind of internal way of knowing that things are otherwise or things aren't
Mm,
actually good.
mm,
Um,
mm. That seems really important.
so I'm kind of respecting those two bodies of knowledge, your own body and your own sense of what's happening, and also larger collective senses of bodies of knowledge that might contradict that, might support that, but also that kind of having that ability to, I don't know, to differentiate between the two and making sense of the world.
I love that. That's really great. I feel like that really gets at, like in a really useful way, at one of the maybe like too easily unraveled knots that we have, where it's like people feel that people feel their real sense of being to be harmed by the university discourse in one or another way, and especially as the university as an institution, like all the rest of our institutions, our political institutions, or fucking banking institutions, etc. It still purports to be sort of describing and reproducing a kind of business as usual world.
Hmm.
And the more that it does that, the more there's this like torsion or stretching between the discourse of the university and what it feels like to be somebody who's just trying to make a meaningful life. And I think a really common response people have to that is to be like, fuck this. This is bullshit. This is, this is just book learning. This is not real in some way. It doesn't have enough friction with the material world. And I think there's a truth in that, in a sense, because it helps people. Doing that kind of step of rejection sometimes helps people access certain kinds of lived experience in a richer way. But there's also a real danger because people then are like, okay, cool. So the truth of experience is what it feels like for me. It's like, well, that's fucking crazy. You can't build a world out of that. You can't just,
Mm-hmm.
that's total solipsism. The question is, how do we build a world together? And I love the way that you're thinking dialectically about these two bodies of knowledge. There are the bodies of knowledge, these traditionary texts that are part of what we think of as Scholē, and there are the bodies of knowledge that we make out of our own embodied movement through a world that is falling apart. And that these two things have to be dialectically related, and that part of our job is to be thinking through the distinction between the two. I think that's really smart. That's really interesting.
Mm.
And I hope that like when people listen to the interviews, they'll have the experience that the people that we've been fortunate to have give us some of their precious time to talk about what they've made and what they're making. I hope our listeners will hear that sort of dialectical sensibility. I certainly did as a listener.
Yeah.
Um, I want to ask you one last question, and I think you actually do know what this one is, which is Sarah Begovic. What have I not asked you about? And if I understood better what you're about or what you're doing in this podcast, I might have asked you about. What am I missing here that matters?
Mm. That is a hard one. Um, I think I think for me, first of all, I feel like this podcast is just like the beginning of me understanding this new
Mm,
realm of what we're calling para academia as people
mm,
who are both out, inside, outside, beyond university spaces as we know it. And
mm,
I feel like there's a lot to unpack here, and there's this sort of under common space and
mm,
of people who I don't know, like me, who might be like just in between tasks at work trying to figure out what Scholē is and how to communicate that well, or trying to figure out what the future of learning is and how to translate that well into like a larger audience, like, or people who are trying to like, I don't know, make sense of the world and the margins of professional life, who are finding a hard time finding a space for them that doesn't that isn't falling apart,
mm,
which is hard. I think a lot of people, a lot of fields, a lot of different disciplines are feeling that sense. And I guess the important part of making space is feeling that.
mm, mm. It comes back to that embodied piece.
Yeah, I think so. And this is, I guess, a return for me to, I guess, being a thinker. And it just feels weird to say because I feel like that's all what I always was, and I feel like I've both like accepted that, denied that, like questioned that throughout my journey. Yeah, I think I said this previously, but just that I feel like this is the beginning of understanding and entering this world of para academia, or what it means to be a para academic. I feel like that's an identity that is newly formed for me because I felt like I didn't
Mm,
really have that language or that discourse to identify the type of work that I was doing that felt like scholarship but wasn't recognized as scholarship in an institution uh, formally, but felt like it was still producing some way of knowing about the world that is
mm,
useful,
mm,
um, that is naming this experience that I feel like a lot of us are going through right now of trying to do something that's meaningful, and yet the world is collapsing, and yet you still want to contribute in some ways into not only like just making sense of it, but also of improving it, but what that improving looks like outside of the tools that contributed to that collapse, and
mm,
sort of activating that space, I think, entering that space and knowing you kind of have to abandon the tools that we were given, or the frameworks that we were given, that contributed to said collapse, and still be like, I'm still going to make something. There's still something here. I don't know what that
mm.
is. I don't have like that end goal, but there is something here, and following that intuition, I think, is important. Not only for me, but I think for a larger sense of trying to have a sense of being, have a sense of belonging in spaces that, at least for me, felt like they were shrinking. And I think that's the sense too, um, at least in ways that are, I don't know. I guess I have to go back to Aristotle that promote human flourishing and what that means,
Mm,
and to even have that conversation of what human flourishing is and what a highest good for us can be, and if we can attain higher goods for ourselves within our available means, and how it means to kind of navigate that outside of that, within that, and sort of make something that, I don't know, gives us a time and space to think of what that could be.
I think I want to, on that note, I want to say two things. One, I hope that our listeners, as they hear from the different people we've talked with who are making different kinds of para academic spaces or different kinds of spaces for Scholē outside of the sort of business as usual university ecosystem. I hope that people feel for themselves some of that activation and sense of capacity, because that was one of the things that for me is most exciting about the work that we've done together on the pod, is hearing from these people who are all just fucking doing a thing, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And I think, and that gets to the second piece for me, which is there is a lot about things falling apart that is dramatically horrible, and in some ways the sort of the death of the modern university ecosystem is one of the least dramatically horrible parts of that. You know, look at Iran right now. But it's also the case that something that matters, as problematic as it's been all along, as sort of hoardy, like HORD-Y,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
hoardy and exclusionary as it's always been, that there's still a certain kind of like intuition about how to live well together that is going away, in as much as it has been encoded in a set of material circumstances for a long time. And so I really hope that as people are hearing what other people are doing, that they have this sense of, hey, I can do that actually. And there's a certain freedom in, okay, well, if this world is falling apart, cool. Maybe you don't have to be the best fucking Chaucer scholar of all time to get the one Chaucer job that there is this year or whatever. I
Yeah.
mean, you
No,
know,
it's real
maybe
though.
maybe you can be somebody who thinks about Chaucer and thinks with other scholarship about Chaucer, and maybe publishes something about that, maybe doesn't, but finds other people who are engaged in the kinds of thinking that reading Chaucer and reading scholarship about Chaucer, and maybe publishing an article or giving a conference paper or participating in a, you know, making a podcast, whatever, some other mode of scholarly activity. maybe there's a certain kind of leveling freedom if there's lots and lots of pockets and nodes of people just doing a thing all over the place, instead of that somehow having to all be concentrated into the Bostons of the world, like the places that hoard the most prestige and the most cookies, the most symbolic capital, and the biggest and the best. And like, we know it's not the case that the people who occupy they're not idiots, but they're not like the best scholars. They're just the people who have, there's some amazing scholars, there's some fine scholars, there's some mediocre scholars. But if you occupy a pinnacle space within a system for hoarding symbolic capital, what that really means above all else is that you have successfully hoarded symbolic capital. Like,
Mm,
that's what it means. Now, you might also be an amazing scholar, and some people are, but the question of amazing scholarship is not really one that's answered by hoarding Scholē. And I like, this is, I'm kind of an inveterate optimist. People often wrongly accuse me of being cynical, or I'm not at all. Like, it is, of course, the case that our world is collapsing, and this will be very horrible for many people, probably including me, as my house burns maybe this summer. Who knows? Things are going badly. But, but, I really take a lot of heart in listening to our interviewees and thinking about the ways that people are are already and will be only ever more making space for thinking together, and that there's a breaking down of the world, there's also a breaking open of the world.
yeah.
Something, other things become possible. So that's something I really hope that listeners take away from this first season. And anything else you hope people take away, or you want to ask me, or make sure that I finally fucking get that I've been missing so far? Anything? Last thought here for today?
Just yeah, I think there's always possibilities, and if you're listening to this, just thank you for thinking alongside with us, and yeah,
Mm,
thinking through these
mm.
possibilities together, because I think that's at the heart of it.
Awesome. Thanks for being a guest on your podcast today, Sarah.
Thank you, Ira. Tune in next time.
Thanks, everyone. Tune in next time. Indeed, we're picking up with Gio Mayer, who is going to talk with us about the W.E.B. Du Bois Movement School for Abolition and Reconstruction in our inaugural episode of the podcast. So this is sort of a pre-podcast. Coming up soon, the podcast itself, Scholē IRL. Don't fucking miss it.
Don't miss it, y'all. Bye.
Watching as the vortex spins below, you throw an insult to the volcano. Oh, my lord, is nothing sacred anymore. No, no.
Thank you to Devin Church for making music available from his album All That Solid Melts into Air. For a link to Devin Church's music and other key resources on today's episode, check out our show notes.